No, I'm kidding. No, this thing is awesome.
I guess you like road stuff. What are you going to talk about?
Oh. Yeah. With that one, I think this is good. Fear. Yes.
Let's actually go to 10 p.m. What? Well, let's actually go to 10 p.m.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Can you hear me? Okay. No. Can you hear me now? That's better. Thanks so much for coming. And in spite of the reschedule, you're all here, and I'm so happy. We have an amazing lineup of people tonight to talk about the Muslim ban. I'm going to start from left to right. We have Maureen Kasana, a journalist based in New York City. She writes about digital media, race, religion, and has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Al Jazeera America, Jadaliyya, BBC, Guernica, and Guernica Magazine, among other places. Prior to moving to New York City, she was the staff writer for The Nation in Pakistan, where she covered the post 9/11 global war on terror. To her right is Mustafa Bayoumi. He's the author of the critically acclaimed How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America. His latest book, This Muslim American Life, Dispatches from the War on Terror, was chosen as the best book of 2015 by The Progressive magazine and was also awarded the Arab American Book Award for nonfiction. Next we have Mariam Jamshidi, who will be moderating tonight. She's the founder of Muftah.org, a digital magazine focusing on domestic and international issues affecting countries in the Middle East and North Africa. She also serves as acting assistant professor of lawyering at NYU Law. She has over 10 years of experience working on issues related to the Middle East and North Africa. Next, we have Fahd Ahmed, who you might recognize from the JFK protests. Fahd has been a grassroots organizer on the issues of racial profiling, immigrant justice, police accountability, national security, and educational justice for over the last 16 years. He is currently the executive director of DRUM, Dacey's Rising Up and Moving, where he has served in various capacities since 2000. Last but not least, we have Arun Kunani. Arun is a professor and a Verso author, the author of The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror, which Verso books published in 2014, and we have on sale here. Arun also contributed a chapter to Policing the Planet. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll hand it over to Mariam.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming out, for hopefully not coming out yesterday and also today. Sorry about the weather. although it was not my fault. I'm glad we were able to still do this. So, and of course, thank you to Verso for hosting this event, making the space available. This is an issue that's obviously very important to everyone in this room and also nationally. And finally, to our amazing speakers for being flexible and being able to make it today as well. So it's been a wild ride since January 20th, and it's been particularly out of control since January 27th, which is the day when Donald Trump officially signed what has become known as the Muslim ban, Executive Order 13769, to protect the United States from foreign terrorists. So, as you all probably know, this executive order prohibited entry for the nationals of 7 Muslim-majority countries for a period of 90 days. It also stopped the refugee resettlement program for 120 days and banned the entry of Syrian refugees indefinitely. There were aspects of the ban that many have now described as also creating a religious test. So the ban issues on January 27th. 5 a.m., I think, on January 28th, the ACLU files the first case challenging the ban. Later that day, protests break out all over the place in airports across the country. That evening, a court in Brooklyn issues the first decision on the ban for that ACLU case, suspending it sort of narrowly, but nevertheless putting a temporary injunction on the ban. A number of other courts filed suit in other cases. On Monday, January 30th, the states of Washington and then Minnesota together filed a complaint seeking another temporary injunction nationwide for this ban. On February 3rd, that injunction was granted. And then yesterday, the Ninth Circuit upheld the temporary injunction. So there are still a number of other cases pending across the country. The injunction itself will be litigated in the lower court now. So there's still a lot that will happen with respect to this ban, but a lot has happened already. Even more importantly, the Muslim ban isn't the beginning of anti-Muslim sentiment in this country, as hopefully we're all aware of. It is perhaps the most explicit and most obvious manifestation of that sentiment, and obviously has come under the reign of a president who is also himself very explicitly Islamophobic. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how we got here, the 16 years of policies and practices that created an environment that allowed the Muslim ban to become a reality. We're going to talk a little bit about the ban itself, and then we're going to talk about where we go from here. Where does activism take, what kind of activism should we be seeing going forward? What kind of policies can we expect the administration to take with respect to Muslims going forward? So we'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then I want to open it up to the audience to ask any sort of questions that you have. I'm going to keep my questions pretty broad, so hopefully that'll allow for a conversation that's a little bit more interesting. So let's get started. So who was worse for Islamophobia, Bush or Obama?
Oh, man. Should I take this?
Please.
I feel like I'm going to take this because I've been fighting with people on this for a while. You know, the conventional understanding, and I think this goes beyond Obama, too, at this point. The conventional understanding of Islamophobia is that, you know, it's something produced out of far-right bigotry. And while it is true that some of the most violent expressions of Islamophobia is at the apex of the far right, many people realize that a lot of Islamophobia is generously extended to the center-left, too. So one way of tracking that, I've done that with students over time, is I will tally a list of quotations about Muslims and Islam, and I won't give attribution, and I'll ask them, who do you think said it? And there's some of the most vile, vicious, hatred-filled quotations about Muslims, and many times students assume that some far-right Republican in the Deep South said that. But they were shocked one time to learn that the first time that the idea of an internment camp for Muslims became something that, you know, went on air was on MSNBC, and it was the Democratic presidential candidate and retired General Wesley Clark who openly said that disloyal Muslims should be put into camps. And then, you know, it wasn't an evangelical Christian who started talking about, you know, disloyal Americans. It was, people like Bill Maher, Sam Harris. So what I'm trying to get at here, beyond Obama at this point, Islamophobia is something that we assume, the far right has a monopoly over. But when you look over the history of the past 16 years, we've seen some incredible sentiments of Islamophobia from Democrats, Obama included. And one example that I'll never forget that really got me into a lot of, I think, bad books among Clinton supporters was when she started talking about Muslims in terms of how they are only useful if they start talking against radical Islam. So I think that kind of thing, that kind of rhetoric legitimizes a lot of paranoia and validates a lot of, suspect about Muslims. That thing, I think many people right now are finding it very hard to believe, but the kind of ban that we're talking about here has its root in Obama's own list. You've read about it in Mike, in Vox, in every single place people are talking about. This isn't something that happened spontaneously, but that it's happened over time. Another example of that kind of thing, we're hearing about a Muslim register, and if it ever does happen, it would be an extension of, I hate saying this, the Bush initiated and Obama expanded NSERS program, which also has its root in Bill Clinton's terrorism bill in 1996. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not going full anti-Democrat here. I'm just trying to say that when it comes to Islamophobia, it's a sentiment shared by both sides. And unless we start honestly evaluating that, we're never going to have an honest conversation about Islamophobia, because you're, putting all the blame on one side, you're not looking about the complicity of the other. So that's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
I could add a little bit. I think another way to sort of build deeper into that is to be able to separate rhetoric from actual policies and material impact. I think if we use a lens of rhetoric, it's very easy to sort of hone in on the right, the far right, the extreme right, and sort of what they're doing. But if we look at policies and actual material impact, for children that are being bombed by drones, they don't really give a shit about who's the person that's controlling those drones. And when those policies of war, those policies of militarism are the same, or at times worse, from across the parties, then to us it's kind of like when lives are being taken, that's a very important way to actually qualify and quantify and measure what is the extent of Islamophobia. I think there's been this shift in progressive and left politics around a very strong focus on words, on rhetoric, on narrative, and I think it's important. It brings us a lot of understandings. It allows us to move a lot of people, but being overly focused on rhetoric and words hides away the actual material realities that do exist in flesh and blood.
I think just to get back to that point, and this was one point that I was remembering when I was coming here, is that when it comes to policies, we really want to get into the numbers of it, and it's a petty game, but it wasn't Trump's administration that dropped 26,171 bombs last year. It was Obama's. And that's, if we really get into the math, you guys are probably here doing math, that's 72 bombs per day, averaging 3 bombs per hour. So, and these are Muslim majority countries, so getting back to that, right, it's not just rhetoric, it's also policy making, and many people forget that those bombs were not dropped by Trump's administration, but by Obama. One thing that I do want to get in maybe one day, maybe for another panel, is the propaganda of memes. I'll never understand how for people, when I was living in Pakistan, Pakistanis never understood why Obama was so amazing to Americans here, because they saw the side of drone strikes. We saw the global war on terror expanded into the country. So for us, it didn't really make sense. Biden looked cute in many jokes, Obama looked cute. But to people in Waziristan, people in Bajor, this man did not represent democracy. And so when you start honestly looking at this stuff from the angle of someone on the receiving end of American empire, then you understand that this isn't something limited to Republican policy or Democrat. It's all over the place. So getting to the policy part.
So governments oftentimes respond to special interests, right? Especially this government. what sort of special interest do you see as playing a key role during the Bush and the Obama years in particular in fueling this narrative of Islamophobia in this country?
Well, I mean, I think we have this tendency actually to want to look for special interests that we can kind of pin all the blame on. And there's been some very good work done by groups like the Center for American Progress that have identified these kind of networks of Islamophobic propagandists. They've identified like what their budget is. Some people say $20 million over 5 or 10 years. Some people talk about $100 million. And you can trace it, and you can say, well, okay, so with this budget, they've bought themselves a new form of racism. That isn't really how it works, though, because if that was all the problem was, then, George Soros could throw in $20 million and we could have a counter-propaganda and it would all be over. But the reality is that, so the way I understand this is, so when I was doing some research for my book, and I was in Houston, Texas, and in the neighborhood where I was doing research, there'd been a number of kind of attacks on Muslim and Arab high school students. There's attacks on a local mosque. So I was kind of in this neighborhood trying to figure out what was going on here. And in a restaurant in this neighborhood, the owner of the restaurant had made his own poster and hung it on the wall. And what you see on this poster is one of those old photographs of a lynching. And so you see a tree, you see a body hanging from the tree, you see a group of people looking quite pleased with themselves standing in front of a tree. And where you normally see the black face of the victim, instead a kind of stereotypical image of an Arab had been superimposed, and then underneath it the caption was, let's play cowboys and Iranians. In the mind of whoever made this, Iranians, Arabs, all the same. It's a shocking image given that this is a kind of region where this kind of violence is taking place. But it's also very revealing, right? Because what it tells you is that Islamophobia is a form of racism that's built on this much longer history of racism in the United States, right? And so in that poster, you get all that captured. You get the reference to the genocide of Native Americans, right? You get with the reference to cowboys and Indians. You get the reference to Jim Crow segregation, lynching, etc. And Islamophobia is a kind of recycling and reworking of these longest histories of racism. Racisms never stay the same. They always have to reinvent themselves the better to preserve themselves, right? And that's what we've seen over the last few years. So the reason this propaganda and these special interests with their propaganda, the reason that resonates is because it's speaking to these longer histories of what this society is about. When people say America is a nation of immigrants, to argue against the Muslim ban, actually the reality is America is a nation of natives, settlers and slaves, colonial settlers, right? And so, it's coming out of this history. And so I don't think we start 16 years ago. I think we start all the way back, in understanding what this is about. And your point about the relationship between drone strikes, right? I think that so long as we have a system that depends on inflicting violence around the world, right? We will need to there'll always be that temptation to reach for something like Islamophobia to explain why that violence happens, right? Because we always want to tell ourselves a story that, the reason that we are supporting violence around the world is because those people over there are just naturally violent. And so we have to react to their violence with our own violence, right? When you say they're naturally violent, what you're doing is you're talking about a kind of racialization. You're talking about saying it's their culture, it's not our politics, it's not our system, it's theirs, right? That's where the Islamophobia comes in as an explanation to justify these systems of violence. That's why you have this system where we dropped 12,000 bombs in Iraq last year, and yet we're saying we don't want any Iraqis to come in because we think they might be a bit violent, right? So that's what's going on. And what Trump is doing is making explicit in his rhetoric what was already implicit in the policies of the war on terror, as Fahad's been saying.
I think that pretty much covers it. I completely agree with what everyone said. I think the other side of it too is to understand the sort of the mechanisms by which these racisms elaborate themselves as well. And so, in a lot of ways, it's also that happens in political rhetoric, that happens, on cable news, that happens in legislation, but it also happens in the realm of popular culture. And I think that we really need to think about the ways in which popular culture also just ends up reinforcing the same ideas over over and over again. I mean, when you think about Muslims and popular culture, I often talk about the, it's like the old Star Trek shows. You remember the old Star Treks? When people get beamed down to the planet, and you have, you have Scotty, and you have the captain, and you have Spock, and then there's always one random dude who's there with them, and you know that guy's going to die. Right? You just know it even before it's happened, right? And so that's what popular culture is like when it comes to Muslims as well. As soon as you see anyone who's a Muslim-identified character in popular culture, national security narrative immediately, because there's no other narrative for Muslims to exist in. And so that's one mechanism by which this long history gets remade, reinvoked, and is very productive for all kinds of things, as Arun is saying.
And I think, as Maureen was saying, that's reinforced on official levels, that the only lens in which we understand Muslim communities is national security. Even when it's trying to look in their favor, like, oh, no, we should be nice to them because they'll help us with that. It's like, it's just instrumentalizes the communities only as relevant to national security. So issues of like racial justice, of civil rights, of human rights, of workers, of gender issues, all of those don't exist unless somehow they can, again, be subordinated to the policing of those communities for further national security purposes.
Sometimes the Democrats and the Republicans want to pretend that they have some differences in this issue, and there are some, rhetorical differences. But I think it's also interesting to see that when they do fight over the questions of Muslims too, it's this idea that they're fighting over the representation of Islam in if it's in the U.S., then you generally get Democrats somehow subscribing to this idea of inclusion, and you get the sort of more Republican idea of exclusion. But when it comes to foreign policy, it ends up with the Democrats. They also use the idea of Islam all the time to justify their foreign policy ends. So there's an imperial element that gets attached to the Democratic narrative that I think we should never overlook.
So I take the point about this not being something that started 16 years ago, absolutely. But at the same time, it ramped up 16 years ago and became very connected to this idea of national security and terrorism, right? So how do you see that relationship in terms of how terrorism and Islamophobia relate to each other and are now sort of in this relationship where it's almost impossible to take the two and separate them from one another? Do you think that the terrorism narrative is what fuels Islamophobia, particularly in terms of government policies, or do you see Islamophobia as the force that creates this outsized fear of terrorism? Or is it impossible to sort of?
I think that Islamophobia has a direct relationship to the amount of violence that the United States projects around the world. So it's actually very connected to American violence, So if we're looking at it I think if we don't look at it we have to look at it through that lens. Otherwise, we're not understanding it.
But the excuse for American violence, right, is terrorism, right? That's the excuse.
It's a projection of its own violence.
Right. No, I understand that. Yeah. But what I'm saying is that the United States says, well, there's terrorism in the world. Mm-hmm. Forget the fact that the United States itself engages in all sorts of terrorist activity, right? And we need to route out that terrorism. That's their argument, right? Regardless of whether or not it's true, that's the argument they use. Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that terrorism itself is a narrative so valuable to the U.S. government that Islamophobia has been a great way of fueling that narrative to make terrorist-focused policies justify in the eyes of the U.S. public, for example? Or do you think that this notion of Muslims being this true danger is what makes the United States, or what gives an outside sense of importance to terrorism in U.S. policy?
Well, I think from my point of view, Islam is also, it's very slippery as an ideological concept or as an enemy concept, right? Because it has a racial element, clearly, and that actually also connects deeply to European colonial history. But it also has this sort of ideological, I don't subscribe to this, but it has this sort of ideological way that it's also used. So that, in that connection, it links it to the former, the Cold War and that kind of rhetoric. So I think that there's multiple things happening from what you're describing. So part of it is racial, part of it is ideological, part of it's this conflict of civilizations, part of it's a religious narrative. All of these are useful narratives for the American state, and also just an American sense of self. So I think what it really means is that we have to change an American sense of self so that we have a different notion about how America works in the world.
So how do you guys think about the media's role, particularly pre-Trump, in fueling a lot of the Islamophobic rhetoric and potentially policies in this country? Would you like to start, Marion?
I feel like everybody went on me. Oh, man. I think, see, God doesn't want me to say it. It's not meant to be. I think when it comes down to, like, George L. Moss says that before fascism can have any kind of legislative power, it needs to permeate itself through visuals and aesthetics and through spoken word. And in that role, pop culture plays this really, really incredible role in normalizing fear of Muslims, and also media becomes part of that on an institutional level, not taking names. But I think one example that I often go back to, and this is recent, media has a very intrinsic relationship with math. And at the end of the day, it comes down to a game of numbers. And one example that we're constantly seeing at this point, at least from the last time I checked, was when Alexander Bissonnette got mentioned on CNN. He got mentioned 4 times. The Bibo kid, Zihaf Bibo from Canada, gets mentioned 46 times. So that kind of repetition plays a massive role in feeding perception reality gaps for people when they think of Muslims. Because when you constantly reiterate the danger of something that may not even be there, you're telling people that it's okay to be scared of them and that fear can be acted upon politically, institutionally, socially. And in that role, media, I'm very disappointed to say, it's played this fascinating role in just like making it seem okay. And I'm not, again, going back to one thing that I was talking to you about a few days ago. I always love gossiping. But I think what really fascinates me, before Trump even got into, the whole presidential race and everything, he was issuing statements about Mexicans being rapists. And at that time, editors around me said that this is crazy. It's hilarious in a very dark way, so he was categorized as humor and entertainment. And many editors at that time, non-white, I'm going to make this a point to say, many non-white editors had said, no, let's not talk about this man in terms of humor. We need to start taking him as a political threat. So media, before Trump even became a thing, played this role where he was the crazy uncle at the table. And Americans have this really funny relationship with racism. In particular, I've noticed as white Americans, they do this, where they think racism is a removed thing, that the uncle at the table will go back to Kentucky, will keep saying crazy things, but he's not our problem. And in that thing, I saw that at an institutional level as a journalist, where people thought this guy's not really going to become anything. He's going to be fine. And you've seen many people on Twitter making those clips that get thousands of retweets of people saying he's not going to win, and then someone, was that Keith? Yeah, he laughs. He's like, no, he is. So I get that like shade in front looking at that. But the thing is, media has played this crazy role in first not taking him seriously, trivializing the danger he posed, and then once he became a phenomenon, then there was panic. But even before that, when it came to covering Islamophobic policies from Obama, we're talking about surveillance programs, we're talking about post 9/11 security apparatuses. There was no serious discussion about talking about Obama in that particular way, and I still don't know. I'm inadequate in that. I don't understand why people find it so hard to critique that man. But as a journalist, it's been a hell of a ride. To be a Muslim, to be a woman, and to be an editor in this political climate has been really, really revealing in terms of what people think is serious, what isn't serious, and how they treat those subjects. So, yeah, no, I mean, media, I particularly have a big vendetta against how it was played out over these years. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think media, like many other institutions, just replicates the hierarchies that exist within our society. And so both in terms of what it means to be within the media and like sort of being somebody that's a person of color, or being Muslim, being woman, but also in terms of whose voices the media is willing to amplify and not amplify, whose narratives matter, don't matter, whose narratives can be taken at face value versus need to be like evidenced with like documentation. And so, we work, the organization I work with, we organize working class South Asian immigrant workers and youth, majority of them Muslim. We talk about sort of the realities of what NYPD surveillance, FBI surveillance has been for our communities for 15 years, almost immediately after 9/11. And the response we would get is like, yeah, no, but is that really true? Like, can you prove that? It's a freaking covert surveillance program. Like, what do you need me to prove it, aside from the fact that the woman's house was broken down, her son's serving 30 years in prison? Like, what other proof do you need? And so I think, there's this dynamic around, like, whatever he says, like, some people, like, they just get a free platform. But the people who bear the brunt of policies, of rhetoric, of violence, there has to be like fact-checking and background checks and like verified by like 5 different sources. And that feeds into a cycle that becomes, it's a very organic thing. It amplifies, it further deepens the hierarchies that exist, the gaps that exist within society.
That kind of brings me back to recently you saw Jeff Gaffney go into New York Times calling Muslims termites. And that goes back to the whole concept of, talking about objectivity and how much can you tolerate in terms of objectivity. But when you start likening a people to a pest that needs to be excised from society, that's not exactly objectivity. What you're doing is you're giving a man a lifetime in print, which is at this point immortal sometimes if we're going to keep it at that. So yeah, no, definitely it really has been something in terms of like observing a social phenomenon where people did not understand that what he says may not affect you, but people like us are going to see the material manifestation of that kind of rhetoric. So yeah, no, definitely it's been crazy.
So let's move on to the ban itself. Were you surprised by the outpouring of support for the Muslim community when the ban? Yeah.
Yeah, I was. I mean, deeply, pleasantly surprised, like enormously, like thrilled, frankly. And I'll tell you why. Because I remember, Fahad will know this very clearly, exactly what it was like in 2002 when special registration, or NSEERS, was first rolled out. And people didn't even know that it was happening, who were not affected by it. They just went about their daily lives. Meanwhile, within Muslim communities in New York City, it was panic, and not just in New York City, all over the country. And people fled to Canada, actually, at that time, too. And then Canada actually issued a travel advisory for coming to the United States at that time. Because people who were on the special registry list, if they also had Canadian citizenship, were being forced to register when coming to this country. And then Canada objected, saying Canadian citizens should be treated equally if they're Canadian citizens. It doesn't matter what other birthplace they have. And so at that point, in the U.S. and Canada worked out some kind of agreement. They stopped registering people with Canadian passports. But it was a very alienating and lonesome time. I remember it very clearly because I also was talking to my father at the time, who would have had to register, a man who was in his 70s at the time. And he said to me very explicitly, he's like, I am not coming to visit you in the United States anymore. And he hasn't. I go visit him. And now look at what we have. I mean, it's so. I've been writing about this. Many of us have been writing about this for many, many years, even before 9/11. And I can tell you that most of these years, up until quite recently, the narrative was like, oh, Islamophobia doesn't really exist. Prove it to me. Mm-hmm. Now there's actually a recognition, I think, of it. There's something kind of gratifying about that, just from the point that we've been doing this work for so long. And so it's really, really amazing to see social movements sort of galvanizing around this issue that I've felt has very alone with, or I think many people have.
So we were one of the organizations that called for the protests at JFK on the Saturday, because we were hearing reports by Friday night. I think my expectation was we might get 1,000 people, because the post-election people are mobilized, and this has been a moderately high-profile thing. When we got there, I was there by like noon. It was like maybe 150, 200 people. By 3 o'clock, it was like maybe 400, 500 people. By 6 o'clock, it was like 6,000 people, I think. And I think, so, and it's not just about numbers, it's around, there was a sense of community there. We were getting boxes of pizzas delivered, and we're like, who sent them? And they said, some group in Long Island called, and they said, please deliver And then, like, we had conversations with the delivery people saying, like, we don't deliver to parking lots, and we had an argument with them, like, what do you mean just deliver to the parking lot? And so, like, I think there is a moment, there is an opening that's happening, I think, in the aftermath of the election. And I think it is a very beautiful thing to see that people are becoming open and engaged. I think the two questions that we continue to sort of want to hold is, how do we sort of consolidate people that are now newly mobilized into the ongoing efforts and movements? If we get time, I'd like to talk about that later. And then secondly is also being mindful of, like, sort of what we are responding to and what we're not responding to. And so 2 days before, well, I mean, even within what's being called a Muslim ban, like there's a refugee ban within there that extends far beyond Muslims. There's lots of other ugly surveillance stuff in there, which also is not being talked about. 2 days before that was two executive orders, one that expanded the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, further militarizing the border, which has deep impacts on communities on all sides. There was also a executive order on interior enforcement, which said not only immigrants that have criminal records, but also that have been charged with crimes, and those that have done acts which can be charged are now priority for deportation. And there was no response to that. No response. And essentially what it does is it gives the Trump administration, ICE, DHS, CBP, the unions of all of whom completely voted for Trump, a green light to completely start to take out immigrant communities. And as of 2 days ago, that onslaught has started. And so I think, there is these things that we kind of, some of it like ends up being like, messaging, like something just hits, like it's a spark, and like kind of it picks up. Sometimes there are certain hierarchies around like sort of, who are people we value, who we don't. Immigrants and any sort of interaction with the criminal justice system, like automatically are completely invisibilized. And for our communities that are over-policed, for Muslim communities that are over-surveilled, like we can't escape the criminal system. Like it's in our neighborhoods, it's in our institutions, we're being watched, they have lots of information on us. And so like if we don't look, again, I think I kind of keep wanting to come back to like sort of material impacts, material possibilities, mechanisms, like we have to stay grounded in that to help us kind of continue to build broader, continue to build deeper, to be able to fight back.
Okay, so just quickly, three things on the protest that I'd want to say. So firstly, they worked, right? Or they're working for the time being, because there is no way that you would be getting these kind of court decisions coming out now if it wasn't for the number of people out on the streets that has kind of empowered judges to take a stand that I don't think they would otherwise take, right? Courts are... courts give a lot of leeway to the executive on immigration normally, and by saying there are thousands of people here actively disrupting this, we are shining a light on those judges in a way that, as Mustafa was saying, wasn't happening 10 years ago, certainly. Second thing, the Democratic Party has nothing to do with these protests; they're playing catch up with this movement, right? Third thing. The principle, it seemed to me, that these protests embodied was what was on that placard that went online quite widely, that said, "First they came for the Muslims, and we said, not today, motherfucker." Right? Now, it's for me, that's what we're doing with these protests, with these airport protests, is we're saying, and we understand the logic of what this administration is about. We understand that you stop it at the very start, because the logic is it will get more and more extreme, and it will criminalize and harm more and more people, right? It's that thing from James Baldwin, they come for one group in the morning, they'll be coming for another group in the evening, right? So you stop it with the first group, right? And I mean, I think the logic of this is that I think the Trump administration thought that Muslims would be the easy group to pick off first, right? It turned out they didn't actually find it that easy, right? But they thought they would be the first group to pick off, and then they could go for undocumented migrants. The aim of all of these executive orders around immigration is to change the ethnic composition of who lives in the United States, right? It's to whiten that population. essentially, right? And all of the executive orders that I think are going to come through around immigration will all have that purpose, right? To undo the post-1965 kind of idea, at least in rhetoric, of America as a multicultural society. Stephen Bannon, what he says about Muslim immigrants, these are not Jeffersonian Democrats. These are not people with thousands of years of democracy in their DNA, right? So almost a kind of cultural, biological notion of who these people are and therefore why they must be excluded, right? So this is, I think we shouldn't shy away from calling this a kind of ethnic cleansing, right, that's going on here. And I think it's because people sort of instinctively understood that they wanted to stop it at its first step with the airport protests.
Just one quick comment, and then I'm going to ask a question. But your point about the protests actually making a difference and impact on the courts, a lot of conservative commentators, or even liberal commentators, have tried to argue that, no, the protests made no impact whatsoever. The courts did what they did because they were following the law. But in fact, the Ninth Circuit decision, the last few paragraphs focus on the public interest and talk about how this has mobilized so many people, and then conclude that the ban is therefore against the public interest as well. So I think that it's important to understand how important mass movements are in moving courts in particular directions.
I think there's one thing to add on, like similar to a point that was made around like objectivity and like, the stuff that gets throws around. Like, law school is like a mind trip of an experience, right? Like you're reading the same paragraph, and based on who you are, like it has very significantly different meanings to you. And then if I talk to her for like 30 minutes about her realities, her life, her experiences, and then I read the same thing again, I'm going to have a different experience, right? Nothing exists like completely in a vacuum, and so even I think whatever they read, like yes, they're judges, they're trained, like whatever. The fact whatever they saw on TV, whatever they read in the newspapers, influences how they're going to read what comes on paper.
Mm-hmm. And they knew the public was watching them very clearly. I heard that they think that it was at least 1 million people who were listening to oral arguments. 1 million people never listen to oral arguments in this country.
Not even at the Supreme Court.
No.
Let alone at like
especially the Supreme Court. Okay, so I would actually like for our last question to be the one that you actually raised in your comments about how do we harness this energy now, and where do we direct it? I think, as hopefully many of us know, there are other pieces of legislation that are pending in the Congress right now. One is, I believe, a Senate bill to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, which will be used to shut down or at least severely curtail the work of Muslim civil rights organizations and other Muslim organizations in this country. There's a bill in the House, I believe, to give Trump the ability to launch a preventative war against Iran related to its nuclear program. So there are a bunch of things. There's local legislation, some pending, some passed, again targeting the Muslim Brotherhood and preventing law enforcement from interacting with them. But of course, there are all these other pieces of legislation as well, some of which you've mentioned, the executive orders on the wall, the immigration policies. So how do we harness this energy, and what direction should it be directed towards?
So I think I'll have a few quick thoughts on that. I think one is just sort of pulling together both the question and what Arun was saying is, what is the orientation that we have for this particular moment? And I think the way that we've been framing, our members in Drum have been framing it, is cede no ground, not an inch. Like, we don't negotiate with proto-fascists. There's no compromise with proto-fascists. And so we do have to have an orientation of like not ceding any ground. Now, that sort of orientation requires a lot of commitment. It requires a lot of endurance. We're not going to have 4 years of protests like at JFK. Like, people will get tired, right? And so, before I get to the point about people getting tired, we also have this new wave of people that are becoming engaged. And they're going to be people, and I think the left continues to do a disservice to itself by sort of do you meet the checklist? Do you speak the right language? Do you know this concept? Like, this is a moment where we have to open up, we have to engage people, we have to bring them in, we have to understand where they're at, and like sort of, it's a moment to like really kind of open up and bring more people into the movements. And once you bring people into movements, to me, a most important part is people have to be part of organizations. find an organization. If there's an organization that suits your needs, create one. And I don't mean by an organization like 501c3, but like just some sort of collective. Actually, please actually don't form 501c3. It's too much shit to deal with. For particular purposes, it serves a role, but like we need to have formations. We get power out of the collective. I would take a collective, an organized collective of 10 people over 50 individuals any day. And then like in terms of coordinating the work, in terms of like sort of being able to support each other, in terms of being able to pace ourselves, that can only happen when we're part of collectives that are thinking, struggling, engaging together. If we continue to stay involved as individuals, we are going to keep running around like headless chickens, and we will be tired and burned out like within a few months. And then like people will just kind of drop out of movements. So I think that's really the orientation that sort of we've been offering. And not everybody's sort of meant to be at the front lines of struggle. And like if that's not where you want to be at, then like support the folks that are doing the work.
Is there any kind of policy priority that you think?
Seed no ground.
Seed no ground. Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that question?
I want to, I think, offer a bit of a warning, right? Because I think one of the things that we've seen today is that they may not go to the Supreme Court with the travel ban. They may try to rewrite it, which I sort of half expected them to do as well. But in a sense, I think it's important to also understand Trump logic, right? And I know that sounds like an oxymoron. But I think it's important to understand that that Trump's also will push the forces of extreme violence around the world as well, right? To act. Trump's policies will do that. And so it's quite likely that there will be another attack, or even a foiled one in the United States. And then if that happens, then the fact that the courts ruled against him will be used as a pretext then for all kinds of things after that. So I think we have to prepare for the things like that. We have to really think about what's going to happen in those moments. How do we also maintain the large, broad-based support that we have now, too, especially with the public, because that's going to be really a place where the public will get divided. And so I think that we just have to be very honest and ready for that.
I think the challenge we're going to have over the kind of coming months and years in the kind of, I think I agree with everything you've both said about the challenges and the need for organizations. I think these battles are going to be won by independent organizations that can mobilize people. They're not going to be won, in the end in courts or waiting for something from a Democratic Party or waiting for the military or the CIA to save us or anything like that. It's going to be about can we mobilize people on the streets and build them into movements that are organized. But the challenge is going to be that we're going to have to do two things at the same time, because we're going to have to be able to mobilize against what's coming from the Trump people, but we're also going to need to have one eye on the conditions that gave rise to Trump in the first place, right? As we were all kind of pointing towards at the beginning of this conversation, this is not something that just came about a few weeks ago. So what that looks like, how we do those two things side by side, I think is going to be a real challenge to think through, and maybe we can get into that in the Q&A.
No, I think I'll keep it very, very brief. I think one way to really understand the violence of this, and I've said this before, is instead of assuming Trump is an anomaly, an aberration, something that just happens spontaneously, we need to start, honestly thinking that he's a continuation of former policies and attitudes. He's just the exacerbated form. So, and I hate using the metaphor of it, but he's like the cancer of what we've been seeing, for the past 16 years. So yeah, that's pretty much for me.
Okay, great. So I'd like to open up for questions from the audience. The microphone is up here. Please come up and use the microphone because we're live streaming this and we want people to actually hear your question. So someone get up. Come on. No, everything was super clear. You have no questions, so we should just end this. Okay, one brave person. And then the flood starts. Takes one person, and suddenly other people start remembering, oh, I have a question.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I'm very grateful that you're all out here talking about this. I had a question, and you've mentioned it in passing about the Democratic Party. There seem to be these. There obviously are these two coalitions, right? The sort of upper crusty Democrats, and then kind of the Bernie Sanders contingent of the party. I'm just curious what you think about how they really aren't advocating for immigrants' rights or the rights of people of color within the party, really. Any of these concerns are sort of on the back burner. They're always, because, we have no other party, right? We can't go to the Republican Party. We're stuck with this one stupid party. And so they know that, and they don't really have to change too much, and they can continue their fundraisers and, blissfully forget about what's happening in the base, right? That's what they call us. So what do you think about the relationships between these two factions of the party? I mean, do you foresee any, like you mentioned that there's this opening, right? So how do we kind of capitalize on that moment?
Anybody want to take that one?
I'm going to give it to Bob.
Okay. I think so I'll speak from Drum's perspective. We do see this as a moment that we have to not only engage with, but work in partnership with center forces, so like taking us as left, like center forces. I think, but the challenge we have is they're much bigger, they're much more well-funded, and so what often happens is whenever left forces enter into partnership with center forces, they get subsumed by the center forces, and we end up just kind of tailing the Democratic Party, whichever portion of it. And I think for us, it's like, how do we, for this reason, one of the reasons that it's important to channel the individuals of energy that's coming into organizations is that you build longer lasting power, and that power can then be leveraged. I think that's one thing. And then secondly, there are certain things that we can do that those folks will not do. It's our forces that are going to call people to JFK. It's our forces that are going to be out on the street. It's our forces that are going to build defense committees in the neighborhood to protect us from ICE raids. There's these things. It's our folks that are going to figure out how do we provide people health care when the existing crappy healthcare system gets cut. And so I think it's an understanding of what are the things that we are skilled at, what are the things that we can provide, and how do we sort of take the leadership in that work and partner with those forces to support us. Another way that we frame it is, we've been doing sort of work in building neighborhood defense committees. When we did the launches of them, we actually told elected officials, there's only one elected official that will be allowed to speak. The rest of you got to stand behind the impacted people. You don't get to speak. You're here to listen, and you're here to take directions from the impacted people that will be targeted. We don't need your grandstanding. And so I think that sort of orientation of how do we put the marginalized, the targeted communities at the front, the experienced folks, that know how to do sort of the work that's needed in the front, and try to get these forces to be in support of that. That's a proposal. I think we're going to be testing it out. We're going to see how it works. I don't think anybody has a completely figured out answer. But we do know that, there are bad lessons of combining with the center forces and then just being subsumed by them. We do know that places where the left was too purist and said, we don't need to work with them, it ends up being one after the other. First they'll come for the center, then the left, or they'll come for the left and then center, and we're all going to be screwed. But I think that's some of the thinking that we're trying to bring and trying to implement and experiment with.
Charlie Schumer's not going to save you. Right? And neither is Cory Booker. Like, I think we have to kind of get away. I don't think people in this room are like this, because we're the American carnage here, so that's good. I think we have to get away from this idea, too, that somehow the politicians are even responsible. Yeah. And what's really exciting over this last, 2 weeks was it really seems like it's the people who are leading the politicians rather than the politicians leading the people. So, fall back on that. I think that's definitely what we've seen. And the way to maintain, somewhat, I think, what I think, to sort of paraphrase what Fahad was saying too, is I think a lot of that also happens really, really, really at the local level, right? And so it's about pushing at the local level at every stage, knowing which issues that are important to you, and you're pushing at them. Like we have so much deference for the national level politicians. They just walk around like they're celebrities. I mean, I don't think that they're very responsive. And I've been to several of the demonstrations, and it was great to see, for example, when Cory Booker was speaking at the Battery Park one, people started shouting, shouting him down. The same thing with Charles Schumer. And I think that that's right, I mean, they're supposed to represent us. We're not supposed to defer to them. So I think that we're getting, the sort of politesse that has been around American politics for too long has really damaged American politics. We don't need to be that polite. And so let's just give that up for a bit.
Yeah, building on that, I think in terms of journalism, and I've said this before, it's really important. You need to start being more adversarial in your tone. This deference, this constant respect for politicians doesn't really get you anywhere. So the more in your face, and I'm not just saying get into fights that I've been doing over Twitter, I know that, but when you see them, call them out, shout them down, that kind of thing. I definitely believe in what Mustafa said. This constant respect really has no basis. It doesn't get you anywhere. So from now on, cede no ground, that thing, I really, really believe in that. I think that power will show us a lot of results in the coming years.
More questions? Can you come up? Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone. Hi, Marie. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that you brought up, and one was about the racialized aspect of Islamophobia, and another is this idea of building coalitions. And something that's been bothering me personally, and I've been also questioning myself about, is how we, in the sort of immigrant and first-generation Muslim community in this country, could do maybe a bit more to reach out to the African-American Muslim community in this country. And I think that it's all kind of along a spectrum. I mean, from surveillance to police brutality, it's all, the same sort of underlying issues that drive those. And I know that it makes sense because this is an immigration-related issue, for our communities to be more sort of the voices of it. But I don't think anyone's under any illusions that citizenship is going to protect us in the future as Muslim Americans. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or any experiences where those sort of bridges have been built successfully, or any ideas about reaching out, or how we can kind of come together to address the larger injustices. Thanks.
Was your question specifically about outreach to the African American Muslim community, or the African American community more generally? African
American Muslim community specifically.
Okay.
I think on a very, very, very local level, I can give an example, a successful example of that. I used to live in a building in Prospect Park South, just on Beverly Road, and so the building has a predominant African-American Muslim demographic, and also some Pakistani Muslims. And the thing is, there's this unspoken rule: they don't call the cops. Doesn't matter what happens, nobody calls the cops. You do communal justice, you sort it out between each other. The idea, it was really fascinating because Pakistanis didn't understand this. They said the NYPD seems okay to us. They spy on us, but they haven't killed us yet, so we should be okay. But then they started seeing, and it goes back to the thing that Angela Davis said, that everything is connected, every single thing. And more solidarity is, it happens when you start connecting the bridges and seeing that your oppressions are all connected together. They come from an integral source. So that building, it was amazing. I was living there. They made this rule where the cops were never called. These were immigrants. The issues were always, human beings have issues all the time. There was this understanding of each other's issues, and they would show up for each other. For instance, when this kid in our building was taken away by the NYPD for a surveillance program thing, he was snitched by a crawler The crawlers are people who show up in masjids and mosques, and they pretend to be Muslim, but they're actually listening to you and what you're talking about. And so this kid goes away, the African-American Muslim immigrant, the African Muslim people in that building, they showed up for him. And when the Black Lives Matter protests and the Muslim connection became more apparent, people started showing up for each other. So I think this happens at a very, very, very local level, and that can be built up on an institutional level. So, yeah.
I think building off of that is the pitfalls we have is when we expect it to do it top down.
Yeah.
And so, we think about like sort of levels of solidarity. What does it mean to like sort of, just express solidarity? Like, like I yell a chant or like I write an article. That's like one thing. It doesn't mean that it's not important, but it's like the first level. Second level is like sort of actually like starting to express solidarity by like sort of moving around, right? And so like what happens if I show up to like when something happens in your community and then you show up to my community? But it's very much on this idea about like, we have to protect you so that you can protect us. But it's still kind of transactional, right? Then there's like sort of an embodied where like we actually put our bodies kind of on the line. Right, and I think this is what we often see with like, and this is the one that's the most popular within our movements, like what we see badass activists do. It's like, like chain yourself to the police precinct. But the folks that are doing that work are people that are already politicized. But a real transformation solidarity happens when it's actually the people that are already marginalized even within their own communities. So Pakistani immigrants and African American Muslims as tenants, right? They're not being facilitated by any organization. They're not being facilitated by any leaders. Like they're just everyday people coming together and figuring out like, how do we work together? When it's, like for us, like undocumented South Asian immigrants have been targeted by surveillance, meeting with like Latina mothers and meeting with Black mothers that had their kids killed by the NYPD and being like, I'm here for you. And we will not take on any sort of like, we will reorient our own struggles so that they don't undermine your struggles.
Exactly.
When people for whom those, so to give an example of this, like comprehensive immigration reform comes up every few years. The last time it came up in 2013, the proposal would have benefited like 80 to 90% of our membership. But there was strong components of U.S. border militarization and strong components of criminalization, which have disproportionately impacted particularly Black immigrant communities. And our members, who would have largely benefited from this program, voted against supporting the bill because of the relationships and solidarity building they had done. These are people that have been undocumented for anywhere from 3 years to 26 years. Undocumented immigrants, someone who have been undocumented for 26 years, said, I will not take this bill which would benefit me because it undermines somebody else's struggle. That sort of stuff happens. It's easy for me to say that we don't support this bill. It's something else for somebody for whom that means their actual existence to actually make that decision. And so to me, that brings back to the question of organization. How do we get involved? Who do we get involved with? Who are we engaging? If we're just talking to people that look like us, talk like us, we're limiting ourselves. There's value to that, but it's very limited. How do we actually start to engage everyday people? How do we talk to people that are not already politicized? How do we understand their struggles? How do we work with them around what would it mean for them to realign their struggles in solidarity with other people that are undergoing struggles? And to me, that's really the core of like where that work really happens in the most successful way.
So I just co-authored a piece on Vice, actually, that talks about a guy called Ayub Abdul Aleem, who's a 38-year-old Black Muslim who's currently in a state prison in Massachusetts. He was surveilled for 8 years after 9/11. And we obtained the FBI files that detail why he was surveilled and the nature of the surveillance. And essentially, the reason he was identified was because his father was friends with Malcolm X. So post 9/11, a Black Muslim is being seen as suspicious because of these longer histories that reach back to the 1960s that we kind of thought are a different era. And so these government agencies are treating these continuities between the post 9/11 environment that we think about as an era of criminalizing the immigrant Muslim, right? And they're seeing that as something that connects back to the 60s when, the figure of Muslim radicalization was the black Muslim, right? So if they're making those connections, we should be too. And understanding that, that there are connections here. Now, what the politics of how we organize against that looks like is, I think, actually, I think it's kind of easy to say, oh, well, we all share this common enemy, so let's all come together in solidarity. It doesn't really work like that. And sometimes when we use phrases like people of color, we kind of, I think, camouflage very real differences and experiences in a way that can sometimes be counterproductive. So, what this looks like in terms of organizing is difficult, actually, and complex. But certainly, from the side of the government, they are making those connections and continuities.
One thing that just goes back to the connecting part is that I had to go to the mosque to talk about this, and this has been a very, very tough time to bring non-black Muslims to talk about anti-blackness and its historical nature in the United States of America. And so telling an elderly body of like Pakistani people that we have to also keep this in mind, that Islamophobia is not a post 9/11 phenomena. It goes way back to the first time a slave was brought here, because 20 to 30% of that body was actually Muslim. And so that kind of historical awareness has been a very difficult conversation to have with non-black Muslims at this point. I know as a Pakistani Muslim woman having to tell my folks that, this is a thing that happened. We're not the ones only being targeted. We're actually pretty new to the game here. So telling that kind of conversation it's a very ongoing thing, and it goes back to the whole purist position that we've taken on the left. I've been guilty of it. I know it, I openly say it, but having that conversation with people, not just in media, but also at your local mosques, in classrooms, is a difficult thing, but it has to happen, and that's the only way we're going to go forward.
Questions? I'm a teacher. I'm going to start calling on people. Come on up.
Hello.
Hi.
Now that the idea of a Muslim ban is a part of the general discourse in the United States, how do we respond to the idea of indifference that we might encounter in the next 4 years in certain communities?
What do you mean? Indifference in what sense? Towards what?
Either through a lack of information or past experience in communities such as, I personally have experience that I was in the Appalachians for a summer or two, and I noticed that they didn't really have too many communities of Muslims there aside from the community of doctors that they had. And even the doctors were locum tenens doctors. They were not necessarily there for very long. They were there for about 6 months and they were out. And so how do we address indifference from communities that are beyond?
The big cities?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thoughts? Sorry, Pai.
I always go back to just sort of organize. I would actually say that indifference is actually not limited to people in the city. That indifference exists in our own damn communities, right? There's people, one of our members, her son, who I mentioned, is serving 30 years in prison. Her own family won't talk to her, right? There's those of fear. There's those that happened to them. They must have done something wrong. And so just keep your head down. I think indifference exists on multiple places. And the only thing is people, we just need to get out. We need to get out, talk to people. We need to engage people. We need to pull together conversations. And I think the important thing is having those conversations and those engagements be in a way that meets people where they're at. Again, I come back to sort of the shortcomings of the left, but in my neighborhood, I wouldn't do a panel like this, right? Calling a panel, it brings in particular people that are already attuned. In our neighborhood, when we're doing outreach, it's either we're literally going to the restaurants and we're hey, bye, can I sit down and talk to you for 5 minutes? and like feeling like, oh, you know, you're a cab driver, you're this, you're that, like having conversations. Similarly, the people that are doing this work in like other areas and rural areas, you know, those organizers, those activists are meeting people at like, what are the issues that you're having? What are the problems that you're struggling with? How do you see that related to like all these other things? Like, you know, we have to meet people where they're at. We have to meet people, start people from their own struggles. And it's only when some of that groundwork has been done that we can really start to engage people on like other issues. And I think we've as movements, we've de-emphasized that work. We've not committed to like actually going out and talking to people. And then the example I'll share about this is in Phoenix, Arizona, in Maricopa County, considered one of the most racist counties in America. Sheriff Arpaio was seated in this election, in this environment. And the folks... Was unseated.
Yeah.
And what did I say?
I thought you said seated.
No, unseated. And, you know, folks there have been engaged in long pitch struggle. And in the last 8 months, what they did was they said, we've tried everything, we've tried messaging, we just need to like hit the streets and get out to the parts of the communities that we have never talked to before. And they spent like 6 to 8 months knocking on doors, not only like within their own communities, which are largely Latino communities, but going into working class white communities and having conversations with them. And again, like, you know, this, we see the environment we're in. You would think that somebody like Sheriff Arpaio would right now actually be like coming to prominence, and he may, the Trump regime may do that. But if we do the groundwork, we're able to move things, but we have to be committed to like doing that hard work.
You know, can I add something to that too, which is, you know, I think Muslims are probably 1% of the U.S. population, right? We're a small population. Like the discourse that surrounds Muslims in this country far exceeds the number of Muslims being able to even respond to the discourse. But what's really, to my mind, what's enormously exciting and gratifying about this moment right now is I think people really understand that when they're fighting for the rights of Muslims in this country, or, you know, because of this Muslim ban, they're not fighting for Muslims. They're fighting for, you could say, the soul of the country, or they're fighting for the principles of this country, the professed values of the country, right? And I think that, you know, any fight against Trumpism is a fight against the Muslims, a fight in favor for the Muslims, then, insofar as it's a fight in favor of justice, as we frame it along those lines. So I don't think it's about indifference to, you know, somebody who has no contact with Muslims. How do we get that person necessarily engaged with Muslim issues per se? It's also about, like, let's talk about, say, increased militarism, or, you know, the sort of extreme policing that happens in this country. If there's another war, like, how are we going to? That's definitely going to affect all kinds of communities in this country in ways. I mean, we're already still existing in all these kinds of wars already around the world. If that gets ramped up, then how is that going to affect all kinds of other communities? So, to my mind, it's just about, you know, a broad-based opposition to the sort of agenda that Trump is putting forward is actually working towards finding, you know, also a place for Islam and Muslims, a reasonable place in this society.
Could I? I want to acknowledge, I really think we should promote the battle for the soul of America, you know, the way that they exoticize and orientalize our communities for decades and decades. Exactly. Battle for the soul of Islam. I've been hearing that term forever. But I think it's good to like sort of try to engage in it. But I think, kind of building on what you're saying, and another way of looking at it, it's, you know, as we're sort of fighting back, like it's easy sometimes to talk about what we're fighting against, but also like, what are we fighting for? Right? And that question, to me, like I think the point I made earlier and the point that Brother Mustafa brought up, is like, what are we fighting for? And everybody has needs, everybody has like visions and like dreams about like what they would like an ideal society to look like. And those provide opportunities for engagement. And so like in rural communities in Appalachia, like there's tons of issues. In other places, there's tons of issues that people are dealing with. We need to meet people like with where their issues are at, and like try to understand like what is the vision? How would we like to see society? How would we like to see in a just economy? And I think like those conversations then open up an orientation to just like sort of being able to think differently. being able to, even without, like, I think the people that have actually been engaged in those conversations, even for the first time they meet a Muslim or like, you know, meet a black person or like something, like they will be oriented in a different way than people that are just kind of taking in, absorbing all the bullshit that like we hear every day from media and things like that.
Thank you.
Hi, I love what you said about ceding no ground, and this kind of picks up on what you had just spoken about. What are we fighting for? It kind of feels like ceding no ground is almost a reactive stance, right? And if we're to take what you had said about this is 16 years in the making, then when do we become proactive and talk about the things that we are fighting for, and what is it that we are fighting for? Who is the we? And when do we get to start working on those things? And what does that look like in all of your experiences?
I'd like to take that one. And so I think this goes back to the earlier question that was asked also around the Democratic Party and the idea of like, where can we lead and get them to follow us? So I think an example that I'll share, and you know, this is not like a solution to be like promoted for everybody, but just is someone thinking around it, is we understand our membership are South Asian, working class South Asian folks. Working class folks bear the mass brunt of any type of these policies that are being talked about. They're majority Muslim, they're majority women, and our membership is majority undocumented, right? So like we're in the crosshairs on multiple levels. And so kind of post-election, it was kind of like, shit, we're screwed. I mean, people were like, I'm going to leave the country, I'm going to move, I'm going to go underground. And then, like, you know, you provide the space, people need to get those emotions out, people need to get the fears out. And then after that, it's like, okay, what do we do? And so it's like, well, we first need to protect ourselves. Okay, who's the selves? Well, it's us, we're undocumented, there's other South Asian folks, there's Muslim folks, there's women. Who else is there in our neighborhoods? Well, there's also black folks, there's also the Latino folks. And so the conversation revolved around like, how do we sort of create a system to be able to defend our communities as a whole? It can't be that, like, you know, I have all the weaponry and stuff to protect myself in my apartment, but next door, like, things are burning down, and thinking that that's not gonna impact me. Right? And so people understand that. And then it was like, all right, are we just going to sort of defend ourselves, or are we going to fight back? And so the conversation also expanded to include, okay, what are ways that we start to deepen our power and expand our power to be able to fight back? So the strategy and the proposal that we came up with is, it's like a neighborhood-based system. We're calling them hate-free zones. It consists around training people on self-defense, on bystander intervention trainings, just like an individual. How do you protect yourself? How do you protect other individuals? It's on community defense. What do we do if an ICE raid shows up in the neighborhood? What do we do if police are abusing us? So like having a anti-raid response system, having a cop watch program. The third part is leveraging institutional power. So this is some of the lessons that we drew upon from our experiences post 9/11, in 2007 after the peak of the immigrant rights movement, and in 2008 and 9 when the anti-immigrant bills were being passed in several states, was that a lot of these policies actually have a very negative impact on business. And there's a contradiction between a particular section of the capitalists and a openly white supremacist, racist, xenophobic state. There's a contradiction there that we can exploit. How do we get those business interests to sort of take a stance against what the government is doing? Once we started talking about businesses, and churches were like, well, we want to be down, and then libraries were like, we want to be down, and schools are like, we want to be down, but we're like, yeah, you don't do shit unless like it's approved. Anyway, that's another conversation. But like, I think it's expanded to like, how do we engage other institutions who have networks, who have power? So for businesses, for example, you know, we work with small businesses. These are the same businesses we actually organize against because they exploit workers in our neighborhood. But these businesses, you know, what happens if they call up the Chamber of Commerce and say, like, what are you doing? against this policy? What's the National Chamber of Commerce doing? What if we take 5 of the businesses and go meet with like the local bank that provides them their loan and says, if this policy goes through, I lose workers, I lose customers, I lose business, you don't get your loan back. What are you going to do? And so similarly, like, there's power that they can leverage. And then I think at the most higher level, like, how do we get them to be actually part of the defense system? Are they going to lock their doors if ICE shows up? Are they going to have contingency plans with their workers that if something happens, how do we make sure that the workers are protected? So it's a system around like sort of defending the community, but it's also getting us to think about like, well, what do we want society to look like? What are the values we stand for? And so we use hate-free zone, but like the full term of it is hate-free zone, love and protect each other. Right? Love and protect each other. I don't know how many people here know us as an organization. Like when we put this out, people are like, are y'all like smoking something? Like we tend to be like sort of a very traditional left, like kind of militant language, like, like blah, blah, blah. And so people are like, what's going on? But I think it's around like sort of how do we create in this moment, like we need to engage people broadly. It can't just be like, if we were to be like smash fascism, we'd have like the same like 40, 50 people like that would come out for an event, right? We do need to smash fascism, but maybe that's not the language we start with, right? Hate-free zone, love and protect each other. You get a whole bunch of liberal white folks in the neighborhood coming out. They're like, what can we do? It's like, hey, come on in. Do you want to like house an immigrant that may be at risk of raids? Yeah. Do you want to throw down and raise some money for an organization that's like trying to organize day laborers on the corner? I think, it provides us opportunities to like open up, bring people in, engage them, and start to like sort of put into practice the vision that we have for our neighborhoods, starting with our neighborhoods, and then like sort of when that starts moving, like it allows us to have a vision that we can start to spread in society at a larger. And this is also where some of the stuff I was saying about elected officials, like you don't get to speak, you can listen to us. So like rethinking also what democracy well, actually, not rethinking. We already knew that shit wasn't working, but like sort of actually like trying to put into practice what a different version of it would look like. What would it mean for us to actually have a say, for our voice to matter, for our lives to matter?
What he's saying is you'll turn up because you think it's this kind of lovey-dovey stuff, but within a few weeks you'll be this kind of anti-fascist street fighter that he's produced out of you. So, I think the answer to the question is that we need to do this thing on 2 levels, right? We need to fight this thing that looks like it's increasingly like a fascist regime, and also the conditions that have given rise to it, right? And it's that second part where we start to think about what kind of society do we want to live in. In the 90s, I was involved in kind of anti-fascist politics in Britain, where I'm from, and we would do 2 things. We would, if far-right organisations came to South Asian neighbourhoods to organise or to sell newspapers, whatever the pretext was, we would physically make sure that they were removed from that neighbourhood. But we would also go to the neighbourhoods where they were recruiting and knock on doors and build relationships. And the way we would build those relationships is by talking about their issues and saying we can actually deal with those issues better than the far right can, right? And that's kind of what the left has forgotten. I mean, I think Ferd's absolutely right. That's what the left has forgotten a little bit over the last few decades. The left's become very gentrified, doesn't really want to engage anymore with kind of regular folk. I was in Britain last year when the Brexit vote happened. In the next few weeks, we're looking at possible far-right presidential win for Le Pen in France, possible election in the Netherlands where Geert Wilders, a far-right candidate, might get the largest share of the vote. That's where the opinion polls are right now. So there's a global thing going on right now, right? At least the United States and Europe, where the centre ground of politics has collapsed, right? The sort of centre-right parties and the centre-left parties are all on a massive downward decline in terms of the number of votes that they can get. The kind of mainstream of politics has been completely discredited by the 2008 crisis and its aftermath, right? And so far, the far right have done a much better job of kind of capturing that moment and exploiting that crisis, right? And giving people a simple anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim message to explain it, right? That's what Breitbart's about. That's what the Front National in France are about. That's what Brexit was about. Now, if we're going to take that on the left, we need to do the kind of stuff that Fahad is talking about, of actually being on the ground, building organizations. That's the way we beat this stuff, right? And it's about saying we can deal with these issues around housing, around healthcare, around education, around jobs better than the far right can at the end of the day.
I think there's one other thing that I would emphasize too, which is we should have a lot of fun while we're doing it. Because we're talking in very serious tones here, but I don't know how many of you, just as an example, how many of you were at any of the demonstrations over these last 2 weeks? I mean, they're so much fun at the same time. And it's really important to have a lot of fun while you're doing this, because you actually are creating that society that you want to be in when you're there. By showing up and having fun and knowing each other on that level, you're actually, it's something profound, and we don't, we can call it political, but I think it's just human society at its most sort of important level, and so we should also be organizing parties, that's another way of you can fundraise through them, do all kinds of stuff, but we should be having a lot of fun while we're doing this.
Thank you.
You forced me to say something because I think that what you're saying, I feel is really important. I mean, it's all important, and what Fada's saying is so important. But on the level of these young, white, liberal people in their 20s and 30s, who have been coming out. I mean, for activists, if we could get 100 people to come out and do something was a big deal. And now, every time we come out, we see between 5,000 and 30,000, like at Battery Park, and they aren't us. I mean, it was always, we'd even go to D.C. and we'd know each other. I went to Grand Army Plaza, didn't know one person. It was the most wonderful thing. So I think that one of the issues is when being at some of these huge gatherings, people who you would never expect because they have their little kids with them and snugglies, and are saying that they want to join these Muslim registries, that everybody will join. People are saying that they want to be escorts. They're talking about protecting the Muslim community. And the question I have is, how do you harness the power of these people who are not disenfranchised people? They're people in Manhattan and Brooklyn who really have a lot of resources. And yet they're coming out at 7 at night with their children, and they are saying, we want to do something. I get a lot of stuff on the internet, and some of it has to do with meetings where people are being trained. Trained to be escorts, trained in registries, trained in civil resistance. I haven't been able to get to one thing because they've been full. I mean, is it possible to do more of that and to reach out? Because I honestly think that these people you would never expect to really get into it might actually do it, and then that is a way of reaching this population that never had any interest in beyond pussy hats. Really. So that's my question.
They call us snowflakes, but we're on a roll. And you know what happens when snowflakes go on a roll, right? We're an avalanche if we want to be. Yeah.
Thoughts on how?
Join organizations.
I think one thing is really important about the registry point. You need people to understand how a registry works. If this registry does come into being, it will probably be an extension of what the NCERS was, and that way you actually can't register as a Muslim. The sentiment is amazing. I want all you to do it, but you can't do it. We're talking on a pragmatic level. So I think one thing that's really important as a journalist that I've learned is really explaining how these things work, their mechanisms laid bare to people, and make them understand this is how they, perpetuate themselves, this is how we're going to circumvent them. So making people understand how these policies work is something very, very crucial, because you want that energy. It's amazing, it's beautiful, and I really, really, really love it. But it's also really important to remember that in that enthusiasm, there's also a need to understand, because it's very easy to build off that energy but still not know how these things work. So that's the point for the registry point. But you had something. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think taking together why it's important to be part of organizations is that's also a place where you can like sort of learn exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And the other point that I was showing around like sort of having relationships with people that are from targeted communities, or like, you know, organizing targeted communities to be able to like sort of say like, here's what this means for us. So for example, you know, when after the election, it was talked about like, oh, you know, this registries program is going to happen, you know, somebody put out like, oh, we need like white liberal folks to register, and like it became a meme, and people were like, yes, I will register, right? So one, it doesn't work like that. You know, when NCERS happened, people were lined up by the thousands outside of Federal Plaza. You had to show your passport from one of the listed countries. You don't have one of those passports, please stop wasting our time, please go, right? And so like you really can't register. But even if we were to say that it was possible to register that way, there's a very dangerous logic about like sort of, this is where the seed no ground came from, was that there's like 20 steps before that. If we get to the point that registrations are happening, 20 steps have already happened, it's too damn late, right? The $100 million have been allocated, people have been hired, somebody got a nice contract to like whatever the data system, technology, you know, all that stuff's already been put in place. And so it's kind of like, that's where the idea of seed no ground came from. And so what we did was we launched an effort to get the Obama administration to undo the NCERS program that's being referenced, which was the previous Muslim registry program. That if that program was not undone, literally on January 21st, Obama had to sign, maybe not even sign, he just had to say the program's back on, and it would have been back on. The only reason it doesn't exist right now is we collected like 350,000 petitions, we met with the White House, we did an action outside in DC, and they took apart the regulations that allowed that program to exist. And so now to recreate that program, they have to start regulations from scratch, which means they have to go to the regulatory process, which, I mean, it's administrative. We may not be able to block it, but at least it gives us more opportunity to engage at every moment. But using that as a case example, you know, there was, while individual folks were like, yes, I will register, the folks that we work with, there's several organizations that organize white folks, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, largely white Jewish folks, SURGE showing up for racial justice, white folks, you know, they were aligned and they threw in behind us. And they're like, all right, we'll hook up petitions, we'll come to the action in DC. And so it's because they were part of organizations, they're connected to other organizations that are frontline. And when they get the message, they're able to share it to like masses of people, right? Rather than like just an individual person who only has like social media to go off of, like, oh, I saw this meme and like a lot of people liked it, so it must be true. And so I think, like, to me, like, it brings back again to the importance of like being organized and like sort of being connected and rooted within your community and with other people.
Can I just say one quick thing about that too? No, really quickly. But you know, last week I did a panel also at the New York Ethical Society that was organized by 2 high school students. You know, and they were like, they started in their high school a Latino Muslim alliance, like Latino Muslim organization, because of like, and they started this during the election campaign, because they saw just the rhetoric that was happening during the election. And then, so they wanted to have the panel during the election campaign, and the school actually was like hedging, as you say, right? Mm-hmm. And then after the election, then there was like even more, then we scheduled it for after the election. It was thought that it was going to be just like some kind of like post-mortem of the election. It turned out to be very important instead, right? And they, you know, their enthusiasm and their initiative is completely to be commended, right? They're I think 15 years old, 14, 15 year olds, and so that kind of thing can happen across the country. At whatever level you want to participate in or can do something, I think that's great. If you have a lot of capacity because you have a lot of, you know, capital in this country, then that'll be great. Like, yeah, I think having, like, you know, even like a blockbuster celebrity concert that's going to be on all the major news networks and is super commercial and all, that's great too. You know, I mean, you can be out on the streets, like you can do, you take everything. Yeah, I think connect. You should connect to the organizations, no doubt. You should connect to the real issues, and make sure that people that if you're talking about Muslim issues, that Muslims are somehow involved in it, and not just objects instead. But I think there's so many opportunities, but people can connect on their own individual capacities and talents as well.
I'm going to add something really quickly. So I think that, for the longest time in this country, there's been passive citizenship, right, which clearly doesn't work. And we're hopefully entering a moment in American history where citizenship is reactivated. And I think a part of that reactivation is individuals, white, privileged, whoever, taking responsibility to go out and find those organizations, right? I mean, we hear this all the time. I hear this all the time from my very well-meaning, very privileged friends of all colors. What do I do? And I want to say to them, you have the internet, you have newspapers, go out and figure it out. I don't know what works for you, right? You know what works for you. So I think that yes, while organizations should be messaging in a certain way to try and reach those audiences, it's really not their job, right, to reach those audiences. They have a whole set of policies and platforms and constituencies that they need to continue to advocate for, right? They can't also be worried about, the woman, with her baby who's come to a protest, how to get her involved, right? She needs to take some responsibility, right, to figure out, okay, how I'm in this moment, I have these resources, how do I go out there and start to make a more sort of systematic and effective difference? So this is not to, be overly harsh on those who are really concerned and want to get involved, but simply to say you have so much at your fingertips, just stand up, and actually take advantage of those resources to figure out ways that you can be involved. More questions?
I'm way too tall for this. So building off the previous question, it's been really great to see how much energy there is. A lot of people are getting mobilized. People are going out to protest. That's great. But at the same time, we have to be realistic and realize that a lot of these people are Hillary supporters who despise Trump as an individual rather than as, as a structural phenomenon. They hate him because he said grab him by the pussy, and not because, he's like basically Trump is a culmination of the system. And these people, they're coming out because they're against Trump. But if Hillary had won and the Clinton campaign had escalated drone strikes, for example, they would be nowhere in sight. So I guess my question is, how do we go about radicalizing these people to make them see the larger picture?
Any thoughts on radicalization?
As somebody very experienced in radicalizing Muslims, I mean, I think that's the opportunity to engage people, right? Like they're out. That's why people are, there's different things, like saying, like we have a neighborhood-based system that's going to try to engage some of those people in our neighborhood. There's some organizations that are already structured to do that. There's some people that are sort of taking the leadership and doing a little bit of what you're saying, like, hey, don't go around asking other people that have already a lot on the plate, like, do this work yourself. But I think it's just kind of like, what I don't want to happen is like the mistake that we've made in the past is like sort of to dismiss those people. Mm-hmm. It's just like engaging them. And so it's like sort of, oh, why you brought you? And I think that's kind of been what's been the beauty of the protest. Like, it's actually like people taking time to like talk to each other. Like, I can't explain why that's happening.
No, it's fascinating. It kind of reminds me of how at the Women's March, it was really funny. My sister and I were together, and we both had a sign saying "Deca Nazi," so we were very clear about what we were going to do. And there was a very well-meaning crowd behind us, and they were like cheering about Hillary, and they tried to pull us in to say the same thing, but we said no. And it was really funny. What I really loved about that moment was, because I usually get very angry about this stuff and I'll go off really bad, but then I thought this is, a prime moment to explain why I am against Trump, but I'm also against Clinton as a Muslim who would see similar policies, dropped into Pakistan. That was a great moment because these were women from Long Island who usually go to kiddie parties. It was really nice. And to explain to them how I stand here for a different solution was really fascinating. And it came back to the same thing. Talking is a very important thing to do right now in this era. We really have had this like gentrified definition of activism where we just stay in our own enclaves and talk to each other, and it becomes, I hate the word, but the echo chamber thing. So what really I've learned in the past few weeks is like I have had to talk to people who I would never talk to, or maybe subtweet. I'd have to directly talk to them and tell them that this is why I'm not happy and I want you to see my world, you know, and I want you to experience my world for a bit. And then I listen to them why they support, you know, her. So yeah, I definitely think on a purely local level, it's something about like going to these places and actually talking, explaining where you're coming from, because there's only so much you can do online, you know. I've got on fire for that point, but yeah, definitely.
I mean, I would also say, you know, like everything's up in the air right now, right? I mean, all the kind of things that you would have taken for granted, the political certainties of a couple of years ago, I mean, they're all flown out the window. I mean, 2 years ago, let's say 4 years ago, you know, if you'd have said in 4 years' time, Trump is president and, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of people out on the streets protesting to defend Muslims, just unimaginable, right? So, you know, the idea that there's this body of people who support Clinton is, well, yeah, they might do right now, this exact minute, but who knows where they're going to be in like literally months, right?
Yeah.
Slightly off your question, but I think somehow it's related. You know, when the executive order was signed for the ban, well, actually, the inauguration was on January 20th, as we all know. And then on January 21st is when the first drone strikes by the Trump administration happened in Yemen, right? And then the executive order was signed on Friday, the 27th. And then on the night of the 28th was the raid, the botched, you know, sort of commando raid, which was the first time that American boots have been actually on the ground since the civil war in Yemen began. Right, and so, and at the same time, too, Yemen is one of the listed countries in the ban. So, you know, I heard story after story about people from Yemen who were not just, it wasn't just the same thing about being stranded because they had the papers to come to the country and then the ban meant that they couldn't come. It was that, you know, they were mostly in Egypt, in Djibouti, and in Algeria and Malaysia, because those are the countries where you can apply, because the American embassy has actually closed in Yemen since February of 2015. So those are the only places that you can apply for American papers. So they would go to these countries, this is what happened last week, to apply, and they were getting their paperwork to come to the U.S., or they had received their paperwork. They couldn't come to the U.S., and they can't afford to stay in those countries anymore either, because they're guests in those countries too, so they actually have to return back to a war zone. You know, which is unconscionable, I think. So in other words, the U.S. is actually creating like something terrible there. And I think that, you know, the reason why I say it's a little bit off, I mean, clearly it's off topic, but it's why it's a little bit connected, is because I also feel like there's a way in which our politics in this country and our activism in this country, I'm speaking very broadly, but I think activism in this country has generally tended to revolve around and sees itself as more successful when it's around domestic issues. Right, and not around foreign policy issues. And I think that one of the things that the war on terror really illustrates, and questions especially around Muslims in the world today and Muslims in the country, is that you cannot separate those two. Like, they have to be connected. So I really do think that when we're talking about the Muslim ban, we also really have to talk about American foreign policy at the same time. So when you're radicalizing those Hillary supporters, just make sure that you have that note there too.
The idea is don't go full communism on them yet, but like, you know, slowly bring them closer and closer and closer. That's what the goal is.
We have time for one more question. Come on up.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here, and big up Verso for hosting this discussion, for sure. I've had so many questions just kind of like racing through my head like throughout the discussion, but I guess to start off, it seems like there's this really just overarching challenge and a fight for logic versus these alternative facts, and like how do we, just in terms of movement building, how do we combat people that don't want to embrace logic, that they're very comfortable in the reptilian brain, and they like just being able to react as opposed to thinking and analyzing? So just on a high level, what are some tools that we have just in general to kind of to combat this inherent challenge that I think that we have. And then I think actually, you guys, I had some questions about just sort of allyship and non-Muslim Americans, which I think you guys actually really addressed in a lot of different ways, which was really helpful. So thank you for that. But in terms of on just a day-to-day basis, Vod, you'd mentioned the importance of linking up and joining with organizations and the importance of that. And one of the concerns that I have personally is, and from what I've seen when I've been out at demonstrations, is our friends at the RCP and Answer. We got all of our front groups that are out there that are doing a fantastic job of recruiting. And I'm terrified of Maoist front groups, of Leninist front groups, and even just to see the hashtag resist. And we know historically, refuse and resist was one of the very active front group for the RCP, for example. This kind of sloganing, and this kind of infiltrating and potential co-opting, and when we are advocating for people to get up and join organizations, also what information or how are we combating these? So thank you. Sorry.
Alternative facts, I'm going to ask somebody else.
Okay. I think around the first point, the importance of doing cultural work, music, art, poetry, stuff that reaches people, moves people. We have multiple forms of intelligence. Logic is sort of just one of them. But people have emotional needs, people have artistic needs, people have physical needs. And we have to sort of figure out how to sort of meet people based on sort of what appeals to them. A very interesting example of this was we had a youth member that was in our summer program maybe 3 years ago. Families impacted by all of these things. Father was one of the special registrants. The family's undocumented. She went through the program, was active in the program, and then just disappeared. She would come out every now and then. Clearly had a lot of love for the organization, but wasn't active. And we're okay, maybe the political work didn't move her. And then in 2014, when the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, and particularly after Garner was killed, we had an action, and then after that, the next meeting, she came to it, and oh, it's good to see you, and just start having conversations, and she's yeah, I just did a dance at my school around the police killings. And so it was a 16-year-old girl doing dances around police brutality in her school. And so to us, it just made us aware that there's intelligences that we're not reaching. This person cares about these issues, but she's not moved by the political education workshop so much. She's not engaged. She's not moved by sort of coming out to protest. She's a dancer. That's what appeals to her. That's the language that she speaks. And so I think there's cultural work that allows particularly this issue around sort of what reality is and what's really happening, what's not happening, that allows us to utilize cultural work to a great extent. The second question was around groups. So I think the recommendation is join groups, and if you don't like the existing groups, then help form one. Mm-hmm. And I think there's lots of reasons to be hesitant about left formations, which have very interesting histories in the U.S. It's very perfectly fine to be healthy of nonprofit organizations. But each type of formation has its pros and cons. Find one that suits you, and if it doesn't suit you, then create one. I think for us, it's just the importance of organization is a factor in itself, not necessarily join an existing organization.
Maybe they can go to one of your parties.
Yeah. My parties.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in?
I think that covers it.
I don't think. You don't build movements out of logic, right? You build them out of relationships, and it's those relationships, those kind of connections we make between each other that give us our power when they're organised, and ultimately those relationships are what stop us all being complicit in these various kinds of oppression that we're talking about, right? And overcome those. So I don't think you go to someone and try and win them over with logic. You win them over by connecting with them, building forms of organisation that mean something to them on a more guttural level. And with regard to these kind of organisations that I don't know what do you want vanguardist groups or whatever that kind of a little bit cultish around how they organise and so forth. Those groups tend to thrive in environments of political defeat. And right now we're in a period where the number of people that are participating in our movements are expanding, right? And so I think actually the concerns about those kind of groups is way down our list of concerns right now.
So we've reached our time limit. Thank you to all of you for coming. One quick advertisement. So Muftah is actually launching its first, or has launched its first fundraising campaign on Indiegogo today. Our goal is to expand our coverage to cover Trump and his authoritarian menace. And so please go and check it out. It's on Indiegogo, and I think if you put in Muftah, it should come up. Again, thank you to our wonderful panelists, and to Verso, especially Mr. Westhouse, and to all of you for coming out. Thank you so much.